Hello, I'm Mark Galeotti of the In Moscow Shadows podcast and blog, and I want to talk about the news that we just heard today, and today being Monday the 5th of February 2024, to the effect that the Central Electoral Commission, CEC, has just recommended that would-be presidential contender and the only real opposition figure in the race against Putin, Boris Nadezhdin, they're recommending that his candidacy be rejected on the basis that they say that something like 15% of the 100 or so thousand signatures that Nadezhdin provided in support of being on the final ballot have turned out to be false or, in other ways, irregular. Now, this is not really a surprise. Look, CEC is completely controlled by the Kremlin, and it's clear that the Kremlin had become increasingly worried about Nadezhdin, not so much for who he was, but what he had come to represent. And look, he may well have been set up. It's easy enough to get people to sign up, deliberately giving the names of dead people and the like. But even frankly, if every single one of those names and signatures was accurate, and certainly Nadezhdin's team did put a lot of effort in trying to ensure that their case was pretty much watertight, well, CEC can basically announce and declare whatever it wants. But it does say, I think, something quite interesting about what's happening in this stage of late Putinism. Nadezhdin was, and I don't mean this in any way to undermine or demean him, was not on the A-list, shall I say, of opposition leaders, which is probably why he's not in exile behind bars or facing being poisoned. But nonetheless, he was a consistent figure, standing more for a kind of, fairly soft political liberal, but also economic liberal sort of platform. But in particular, he'd always shown a talent and a willingness to walk a very, very fine line, to remain, at the one hand, definitely sort of committed to liberal causes, but on the other one, not directly challenging the Kremlin in ways that would be seen to have crossed all sorts of red lines. He was willing, for example, often to be the token liberal on the toxic, shouty talk shows that go for what is the closest we've got to kind of political discussion shows on Russian television, in which absolutely his role was to be everyone's political piñata. But he did it. Likewise, he's spoken out against the war, but in essentially pragmatic rather than moral terms. He has made it clear that he wants a change in government, but he hasn't personally criticised Putin. So very, very careful. But the point is, he nonetheless has become too dangerous, I would suggest, for the Kremlin. Not so much for who he is, but for what he had come to represent. At first, and this is one of the reasons why some people regarded him all along as a sort of a Kremlin project. In other words, as a sort of a fake candidate standing just simply to give the illusion of some kind of real political spread to the vote. But nonetheless, although I don't think that was true, I suspect instead what we can say is that he had actually discussed his candidacy with people in the presidential administration, maybe even Sergei Kirienko, the overall sort of grand master of Russia's managed domestic politics. And they had decided to let him go through precisely because they want to give the illusion of some degree of spread of opinions. Remember, the point of these elections is not actually to select a new leader for Russia. We know who is going to be the leader after the elections. The point is rather to create an act of theatrical legitimation, to try and make it seem as if Putin is indeed the choice of Russia, and that took place in some kind of at least reasonable facsimile of a genuine vote. So that's why they usually have a spread of candidates from the extreme nationalists, sufficient to make Putin look relatively moderate, all the way through to some sort of constrained pseudo-liberals to make it look as if there is that sort of genuine debate. So he was let go through onto this stage of the election, where you actually have to then demonstrate you have a sufficient sort of wide base of support to be a credible candidate. And in this respect, I think this is where he began to be problematic, because it was exactly the fact that he became something of a lightning rod to whom all these various energies of protest and disaffection with the regime could come together. We saw these lines of people standing outside the relevant offices to give their signatures and so forth. People who are opposed to the war, people who are opposed to Putin, people who had all sorts of other grudges. It's not that they necessarily said, that Nadezhdin, I've looked at his economic program and that's what we need, or anything like that. It's just that he seemed to represent the only real candidate who was offering some kind of change. And this is why we also saw the people, for example, behind Navalny, also sort of provisionally supporting him as the best option there was. And that's suddenly when he becomes dangerous, because precisely what I think the Kremlin fears more than anything else is that whether it's economic protests or resistance to a new mobilization wave or whatever else, but something happens to generate a protest, and someone, and it could be a liberal, it could be an ultranationalist, I mean, who knows, but someone is able to do the job that Navalny had set out to do, which is why he was too dangerous to be allowed to continue, which is precisely to cohere this coalition of the fed up. People who don't necessarily agree on much beyond the fact that the status quo is not acceptable to them. So once Nadezhdin had become the tribune of the fed up, he'd become dangerous. Because they had two options. The Kremlin had two options. One of them is they could let him stand, and this would help, first of all, bring out the turnout. I mean, that's one of the things they are concerned about. They want to get lots of people out there voting so that, again, it looks like it's the true will of the people. And then they would presumably crush him, give him just a sort of couple of % of the vote, and claim that that showed that clearly the Russian people are actually behind the status quo. But in the process, they would have had to willy-nilly give Nadezhdin a certain degree of a public platform. And because presumably a lot of people would have voted for him, I mean, at the moment, obviously a lot of the polling is very dubious, but there's polling up to and including giving him 10% potentially, and that's before any campaigning. Not that this would mean an actual electoral problem for the Kremlin, but it would mean that when they then rig the vote, it looks all the more obvious and runs the risk of a backlash, which actually removes any virtue of supposed legitimation. People get angry. I mean, as they did in 2011, 2012, the Bolotnaya protests, which are the largest protests we'd seen in post-Soviet Russia, were basically triggered precisely by a sense that the political system was being rigged, by a sense that their votes no longer counted, and people saying, we've had enough with that. So there was a terror of creating that. Now, again, not because it wouldn't be suppressed necessarily, but it would create questions, dilemmas for the state that the state wanted to avoid. So that was a high-risk strategy. And the point is, I hadn't been thinking that this was a Kremlin currently in a high-risk frame of mind. I think they're trying to make this the most boring elections around, really a civic ritual rather than anything else. So the obvious choice was instead just to decide that you found reasons to disqualify him so that the ballot is entirely managed. You've got, the ageing and pretty supine communist. You've got the deeply unpleasant ultranationalist. And then you've got a figure from the so-called New People Party whom no one knows who he is and what he stands for. But he sort of counts as kind of, sort of semi-liberal. Well, anyway. But the point is that they didn't really care. The main thing was avoiding the threat that actually having a semi-wildcard candidate, in fact an increasingly wildcard sounding candidate, being on the ballot. And the interesting thing is that Nadezhdin himself had said beforehand that if he is rejected, he will raise protests across the country. And this is exactly what they feared. And in many ways, it may be that these threats are precisely what made the Kremlin decide, no, he's clearly not sufficiently house-trained. He has to be removed. We'll see if he can make good on his promises. I honestly doubt it, and if we do start to see these kind of protests, then I think that's the point when they will suddenly be shocked to discover that Nadezhdin is in fact a tax evader or a child abuser or whatever other charge they want to throw at him. So, that's very much going to be a question of how far he's really willing to put his skin in the game. I mean, when Navalny came back to Russia after being healed from the poisoning he received, he knew full well that he was going to be arrested. I mean, that was an extraordinary act of patriotism as well as bravery. Not many people are really willing to go that far. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with and to Nadezhdin. But in terms of the overall systemic impact, I think this absolutely, for the last moment, shows us that the age of dramaturgia, the age of managed theatrical sort of facade of democracy, really has gone. This is no longer a sort of postmodern attempt to control the country through the appearance of democracy and participation. We're now in an authoritarian regime that has elections still, but just like the Soviet elections, these are not really meant to be expressions of the public's desire to decide who gets to rule the country. They are actually, as I said, civic moments where you demonstrate your patriotism and you demonstrate your acquiescence. I mean, that is the key thing. Voting is now regarded as an act of acquiescence by society. Democracy is meant to be about society mastering its political elite, society demonstrating that the people, actually have sovereignty. Now it's the other way round. That elections in Russia are, just as in Soviet times, rather attempts for the political elite to demonstrate their mastery of the country and for the country to roll over and demonstrate that it's willing to be controlled by that elite. Now, many people are going to be very unhappy about this. Will it actually lead to protest? Almost certainly not, simply because of the power of the repressive apparatus still. But it means precisely that they will have to be induced to go and vote. They will be told to go and vote by their employers. They will be lured to the polling stations by goodies on show for sale there. There will be parties. There will be balloon animals. There will be anything else. I mean, and I say balloon animals. I mean, before you think I'm joking. Last time I went to a Russian polling station during an election, I mean, precisely, there were entertainers in costumes and things, so that, it was an event for the kiddies as well. But the point is exactly desperately trying to get people to vote, simply because by casting their vote, frankly, for whoever of this totally controlled list of candidates, all of whom are pygmies, in order to try and make Putin look like a titan. But anyway, just by casting your vote, you are basically saying, I submit. I acquiesce to this regime. And as I said, most people will go through it because they know that, frankly, it's not worth bucking the trend. It's not worth challenging the regime in this particular way because it won't make a difference. But what it will leave is that really sour taste. Frankly, Russians, although it's easy to talk about, in their DNA they accept authoritarianism or whatever, they don't. Especially now that they have had, in different ways, tastes of the opportunity to shape policy, politics, and the world around them. They know what's being done to them. And they may not protest because of the elections, but it means that they'll be that much more willing to resist in the future when, as I think it will be, it's practical issues, economy, mobilization, or whatever, which actually brings people out on the streets. So, R.I.P. Dramaturgia. Surkov, the original sort of architect of this kind of managed democracy, well, we really ought to raise a glass in the funeral of his own brainchild. This is now increasingly a late Soviet regime without the ideology, just with the corruption, just with the authoritarianism, and just with the stubborn determination to remain in power at whatever cost to its own people. It's a sad day, but alas, an entirely predictable day. Now I've depressed myself enough. I will stop there. Thank you very much for watching.